Bibles to Mark 15. Mark 15. As we reach the final portion of Mark's gospel before the cross. And so I've titled the message this morning, Prelude to the Cross. On January 25th of this year, U.S. House of Representatives marched across Congress and officially filed impeachment charges of insurrection against the former president. Tuesday of this past week, the trial in the Senate began. Prosecution opened with their arguments, presenting evidence of these charges of insurrection. They said that specifically, on January 6th, when Congress was meeting to certify the election results, the former president had incited an insurrection by encouraging his supporters who were there at the rally to fight. So they used a few words that he had said during a 40-minute speech. Then one by one, representatives and senators, they started giving their testimony, emotional testimony, a lot of them crying about how they were scared for their life, they thought they were going to die. And this went on for hours and hours, all day. And then the defense arises, announced their turn to make the case. And unsurprisingly, the defense argued upon a legal ground, one that most people watching knew would almost certainly lead to acquittal. And the legal ground was this: the U.S. constitutional provision for an impeachment is reserved exclusively for a sitting president, which means a current president who is in office, not out of office. So most people watching anticipated that this impeachment charge would be dead on arrival. And then defense continued to show a medley of clips and videos of those same U.S. representatives and senators who had brought these charges of insurrection against the former president, of saying outrageously insurrection-inciting things, far worse than what they accused the president of saying. This went on for about an hour. It was incredible. They also used similar language like fight, and even far worse, and it all started when they were supporting the protests and the riots that erupted last year, late last spring, after the death of George Floyd. And the defense was showing this to the entire Senate. And so, unsurprisingly, as quickly as this trial began, it was over. And by Saturday afternoon, the former president was acquitted. And when I think about this impeachment trial, I can't help but be reminded of Jesus' trial before Pilate. And not just because both had to do with charges of sedition, right, insurrection. I can't help but think of Jesus' trial because of the hypocrisy of the religious leaders who were accusing Jesus of the very same blasphemy that they were indeed guilty of, and far worse against God, by bringing these charges against Jesus and their poor treatment of him. I can't help but think of Jesus' trial, and the religious leaders who were concocting phony and fraudulent charges, twisting Jesus' words out of context against him just so they could achieve the political outcome that they wanted. I can't help but see the similarities of pragmatism, of career politicians trying to achieve an outcome that they knew would benefit them at the expense of someone they knew was innocent. Like these religious leaders and like Pilate. Especially like Pilate, who when the chief priests and the scribes and elders now come to him with these charges, now he's in a position where his own position is compromised. And out of fear of causing a riot, he has a choice to make. And he makes a purely pragmatic one, to keep his position and to keep the peace. He sentences an innocent man, Jesus, to die, and he releases a guilty, convicted murderer, Barabbas. Because it was convenient for him. It was the easy thing to do, not the right thing to do. And in this wicked miscarriage of justice by men, we see an incredible irony of the perfect divine justice that God will soon execute on the cross. Because God does punish an innocent in the place of the guilty, doesn't he? The innocent, sinless, spotless Son and Lamb of God punished in the place of guilty, corrupt, sin-sick sinners like you and like me who are now set free. But only if you believe. Only for anyone who believes. And the question you need to ask yourself today is the same question that Pilate asked the crowd. What shall I do with this Jesus, King of the Jews? What will I do with King Jesus? What will you do with King Jesus? And the answer to that question will hang in eternity. So by way of summary, for those who perhaps weren't with us, to bring you up to speed where we're at in the Gospel of Mark, we're at the climax. We're at the pinnacle that we've been slowly marching towards, and particularly when Jesus entered Jerusalem in Mark chapter 11. Deep into the Passion Week. From chapter 11 till now, we've been looking at the final 7 days of Jesus' life. Thursday evening is the last meal, the last supper that Jesus will ever have on earth, which he actually transforms into the Lord's Supper, right? He institutes communion. The blood of the new covenant of grace in his blood, the cup, and his body, his life given over. It goes late into Thursday evening. The Last Supper is over. It's a Passover meal. And then he leads his disciples, the 12 of them, into a quiet place to pray for divine enablement and strengthening that he knows he'll need for the cup and the hour of suffering that lies immediately ahead. He takes them to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he spends time in prayer, agonizing over the cup that comes, but then he submits to the will of the Father. And then exactly as he predicted what happened during the Last Supper begins to happen. Judas comes with a band of temple guards and soldiers to arrest Jesus under cover of darkness, away from the city, away from the crowds, in the garden. He betrays him. They seize Jesus. The disciples run and flee as far away from Jesus as possible, scared for their lives, exactly as Jesus also predicted. And he's all alone. And the guards take him, they seize him, and they lead him all the way to the high priest Caiaphas' house. And then there's a sort of informal trial, a hearing by night, a religious hearing in front of the ruling council of Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin. Chief priests, scribes, and elders formed it. And they line up false witnesses after false witnesses. They're trying to bring a charge against Jesus for the conviction and the verdict and the sentence they've already come upon. They've long decided that Jesus deserves to die. As soon as he the temple started clearing it and condemning their false hypocritical religion, they said, he's got to go. Now they need a charge to bring against him. And so they line up false witnesses in the middle of the night. None of them stick. All of their stories are contradictory. High priest is finally fed up, so he stands up and he takes matters into his own hands and he interrogates Jesus now. He says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One," which means God? Jesus says, "I am. And you'll see me, the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power of God and coming on the clouds of heaven." And at that, the high priest tears open his shirt. That's what they did in court proceedings when they heard a blasphemy, an outrage. He tears open his shirt. And then they all condemn Jesus to die. And then they proceed to punch him, to beat him, to slap him, to mock him, and to spit on his face. The holy men of Israel. Prophesy, prophesy, as they blindfold him. Which one of us hit you? And when they've had their fill of mocking and of humiliation and scorn, they hand him back over to the temple guards to now bring him to Pilate. And then we saw last week, Mark just slowly interrupted that narrative to insert the story, the scene about Peter's denial, which was happening simultaneously as Jesus is hearing at the high priest's house. Peter was in there. He was standing outside at a distance, trying to be incognito. And he denies Jesus 3 times, exactly as Jesus predicted, before the rooster crowed twice that night. And he's broken. He runs away. He breaks down. He weeps. He's in anguish over his guilt and over his shame of betraying his Lord. And now Mark comes back to the trial scene. He comes back to the Sanhedrin and the chief priests in the morning in chapter 15, verse 1. And he says, "As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate." It's the morning time. That trial, that hearing was happening late at night, in the early hours of the morning. The Sanhedrin knew they didn't have the authority to execute capital punishment. Right? Israel, the Jews, as a vassal state subjugated to Rome, they could only go so far with their judgments. And capital punishment was not one of them. And so they knew they had to find a way to manipulate their spiritual charges of blasphemy that they were accusing Jesus of, according to their law, which was worthy of death, into something palatable for Pilate. Something that would convince him to execute this sentence of death that they've convicted Jesus of. Because Rome wasn't concerned about petty religious matters. They knew that Pilate, the governor, didn't care about small, petty religious quarrels of the day. He would have sent them away. And so now they come together. They huddle again in the morning, it says. All of them. The whole council, which means some of those who probably weren't there at night. There's 70 of them. Now it's early morning. For sure they're all there. And now they're coming up with a strategy and with a plan to try to manipulate these charges in a way that would make it certain to force Pilate's hand. And what do they come up with? Well, who is Pilate, by the way? Pilate was the Roman governor at the time. Pontius Pilate, actually, according to Luke 3:1, or Acts 3:1, Acts 4:27, and even Paul, when he's talking about Jesus' death before him or his trial before him, and to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:13. Pontius Pilate. Pilate, or Pilatus, was his family name. And Pontius was his tribal name. And he was the Roman governor of Judea, a Roman province, a minor Roman province, from about AD 26 to 36. And his official title was prefect, which means he was the chief ruler over all affairs and concerns over Judea He had the power over life and death. It was only he and the emperor, Tiberius Caesar in Rome. He was a powerful figure. And the Sanhedrin knew they needed to get him to force his hand to execute this death sentence. And so they come to him. And by Pilate's question of Jesus in verse 2, we see exactly how they've now manipulated the charges of blasphemy to entice Rome. Verse 2, and Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" There's the charge. Pilate wasn't interested in a blasphemy charge according to their religion, which he would denounce and could care less about. But now suddenly, if they present to him that Jesus is claiming to be a king, which he was, right? The Messiah was a royal, priestly, kingly figure from the line of David. If they focus on the regal aspect, on the royal aspect of it, now suddenly he claims to be a king, and to claim to be a king is competition to the emperor, Caesar, and now suddenly he's an enemy. He's a threat to Rome. It is both ironic and brilliant. It's ironic because at a spiritual level, deep down, Jesus really is a king and the king of the Jews. But it's ironic because they are now handing him over to the Romans because he was not the expected king of the Jews that they wanted. They wanted a political insurgent, a military, mighty conqueror. And how does Jesus respond? Does he accept this title? Look at the rest of verse 2. You have said so. You have said so. As you say is the sense behind the original. As you say. I am the king of the Jews, but not in the sense that you think I'm the king of the Jews. Your perception of my kingship and my kingdom is worlds apart from the reality, is the idea. And he actually starts to unpack this in John's account. They have an extended dialogue, him and Pilate here, starting in John 18:33. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world at all. For this purpose I came, to preach the truth. And everyone who knows me listens to the truth. And Pilate says, what is truth? In other words, I'm not interested in having philosophical and theological debates with you here. I'm a pragmatic man. I have more pressing and urgent matters. Namely, your high priest here accusing you of blasphemy and asking me to sentence you to death. So what say you? Are you the king of the Jews? Verse 3, and the chief priests accused him of many things. They accused him of many things. What things? Were these the same things that they were accusing him of at their hearing? No. Pilate didn't care about the spiritual blasphemy. He didn't care about the false testimony of them saying, he said he would destroy the temple made with hands and in 3 days build another not made with hands. That wasn't it. What was it? It was just this. Claiming to be the king of the Jews, yes. But Luke, in 23 verse 2, includes two other charges. He says, and they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. He's misleading our nation. He's a seditious traitor. Not only is he telling us that we shouldn't be paying taxes to Caesar, but he's styling himself a king of the Jews. And these are obviously false charges. In fact, we know as much, if you recall back to Mark chapter 12, when they brought these charges and they tried to catch Jesus in their own tax scheme, pun intended, when they come to him with the question about taxes, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And remember what Jesus says in verse 17? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, taxes, and render to God what is God's, worship. So, twisting his words. He said no such thing. And even if he does claim to be the Messiah, the type of Messiah that he is not a militant, mighty, conquering threat to Rome. He's been the complete opposite. And they know that. He's the peaceful preacher out of Galilee who comes preaching a message of good news, of repentance, of forgiveness of sin, who's full of compassion and mercy, healing the sick, touching the lowly, helping the destitute. Not a political threat. These are fraudulent charges. But nevertheless, serious ones. And Pilate must take them seriously. Anyone who raises himself up a king against the emperor is liable to the charge of sedition. And the punishment for sedition, the punishment for insurrection is death. Death by crucifixion. The execution method reserved for the worst and lowest kinds of criminals in that society. Insurrectionists, rebels, and murderers. And so Pilate continues pressing him then in verse 4. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. He's saying, why aren't you defending yourself? Don't you have anything to say against these accusations from all of your countrymen? Don't you understand that your life is hanging in the balance? The punishment, if you're convicted, is death. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know that I have the power to release you or to condemn you to death? That's exactly what he says in his conversation in John 19:10. And Jesus says, "The only authority you have over my life is the authority that has been given to you from God." So Pilate's perplexed. He's amazed that Jesus makes absolutely no answer, knowing that his life literally is hanging in the balance. What manner of man is this? How could he be so calm, so poised, so confident in the face of certain death? And he's intrigued. He's amazed. And just like he stood silent before the false charges a few hours earlier in the hearing by night in the religious court, he stays silent once again here, exactly as the suffering servant of God we saw in Isaiah, right? Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Fulfilling that scripture. This is not the silence of surrender to human authorities. This is the silence of surrendering to the purpose and the will and the plan of God of salvation. To give his life over into the hands of sinners, so that he could give his life over on the cross to pay the penalty for sinners and rescue and ransom. Verse 6. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. Apparently, Pilate had developed a custom, a habit, every single year during this time of the year, the Passover festival and the festival of unleavened bread, to release a prisoner. This was a common practice. Emancipation of convicted prisoners was a common practice in ancient society. that politicians and rulers would use to kind of appease the crowds, to gain influence with the crowds, to gain favor with the crowds. The Assyrians did it, the Babylonians did it, the Greeks did it, and the Romans did it. And evidently here, Pilate, as the prefect of Judea, is doing that same thing, because he'd lost a lot of favor with the crowd over the years. And so now a crowd's been building up at Jesus' trial as it's going on in the early hours of the morning. And the crowd now comes to Pilate. It's that time of the year with that same request that they come every single year. We want you to release one of our prisoners. And the prisoner that they choose, evidently, is a man called Barabbas. Barabbas. And his name is what we call a patronymic. It's a name that gives away the title of his father, right? Patronymic, like patristic, father. Bar means son, and Abbas comes from the Aramaic word Abba, which means father. So literally, son of the father, or son of the teacher. Sometimes it was used in reference to a revered or well-respected teacher, rabbi. Kind of ironic, isn't it? And actually, we're not told here, but in Matthew's account, in chapter 26, verses 16 to 17, in some translations, not all of them, the NIV, the NET, he actually calls him Jesus Barabbas. And the reason for that is a lot of the manuscript copies have strong transcriptional evidence internally, the ones that come from the Caesarea area, that Barabbas' name was actually Jesus. And it's possible. Jesus was a very common Jewish man's name in that first century society. So common, right? Because it all comes from that same original Hebrew and Aramaic word for Jesus, Joshua, Yeshua. It was very common. So it really does add to the irony of all this, right? Jesus, Barabbas, son of the Father, and Jesus, the true son of the Father. And they come to him, and they want him released. And their other irony is this. They're accusing Jesus of insurrection, and that's why they want him dead. But Barabbas actually did commit insurrection. It says he's in jail, he's in prison, awaiting his sentence of death, which would be by the cross, by the way, crucifixion, along with the other rebels and insurrectionists who committed murder. He's an insurrectionist and a murderer. And actually, that's exactly what Luke calls him. Mark says he's with them in jail, but Luke explicitly says Barabbas was a murderer and an insurrectionist. And they want him out instead. They're asking for him. Which insurrection was this? There was tons in that day and age. Constant uprising and revolts and riots against the oppressive and crushing rule of Rome. There were zealots constantly banding together. There was a movement against the Roman rule in Jerusalem and Judea. And Barabbas was evidently one of those leaders. In fact, those two robbers that we know as thieves or bandits on either side of the cross of Jesus were most likely insurrectionists. The exact same word and language used to describe them. The Romans didn't crucify petty criminals for stealing an apple at the marketplace. They crucified criminals and zealots and insurrectionists and murderers. They're probably in there, for sure, in there right now, awaiting sentencing of death by the cross, along with Barabbas. And they come to Pilate asking for Barabbas. And Pilate says to them, verse 9, and he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Did Pilate, was he confused about which Jesus they were asking, since they had the same name? Maybe. But one thing's for sure, two things for certain. He saw right through the motives of the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. He knew that they were envious of Jesus. He could see they were envious of his power and of his influence over the people and over the crowds, and that's why they wanted to get rid of him. And knowing that caused Pilate to realize and to be even more convinced of Jesus' innocence. And so now he tries to set them up and offer Jesus of Nazareth rather than Jesus Barabbas to them. He says, do you want me to give to you the King of the Jews? Yeah, he's using it mockingly, this title, and we're going to keep seeing it, King of the Jews, King of the Jews, some king. But he knows he's innocent. And he doesn't want to play into the chief priest's scheming and planning. Verse 11, but the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. The chief priests have come way too far in their plot now. They've already had the hearing. They've already condemned Jesus to death. And there is no way they're going to let him slip through their fingers this time, when they are this close to getting what they want. They're not going to let Pilate try to turn the crowds against him and try to manipulate the situation and have them pick Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, over Jesus Barabbas. No. So now they get involved and they begin to stir up and to manipulate the crowds. And the crowd start to chant for Barabbas' release instead. And so Pilate again said to them, verse 12, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? You want Barabbas? You can have Barabbas. But what do you want me to do with this King of the Jews? It seems like he's so reluctant to pass this sentence. It seems like he's so convinced of Jesus' innocence. As ruthless and as pragmatic of a ruler as he was, he doesn't want to sentence an innocent man to death. Why is he so reluctant to do this? Well, Matthew, in his account, provides an interesting detail. An interesting detail that his wife comes to him at this very moment in this scene when he's sitting on his judgment seat. And in Matthew 27:19, she says, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. Have nothing to do with this righteous man? She knows he's innocent. She knows it's not just what the chief priests are trying to do to him here. What did she see exactly about Jesus in a dream? I don't know. Nobody knows. But whatever it was she saw, it so deeply disturbed and troubled her to the depths of her being and of her soul that she had an urgent message in the middle of the trial that she had to deliver to her husband to plead for Jesus' life. Let him go, she says. You can't do this. And so all this is happening at once, all these moving parts. His wife's dream in his ear, the crowds roaring and cheering, asking for Barabbas, the chief priests knowing that they're scheming and have manipulation. Their motivations are evil, they're jealous, they're envious. What is Pilate going to do? He doesn't want to do it. He keeps asking them to reconsider. Right? What do you want me to do with this King of the Jews? In verse 13, and they cried out again, crucify him. Crucify him. And now not only did the chief priests manipulate the crowds to release Barabbas, now they're manipulating them to actually call out and cry out for Jesus' death. Crucify him. Crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him, crucify him. He's losing control of the situation now. The crowds are turning. He realizes he's on the brink of a riot, another revolt. He can't afford another rebellion. His reputation with the Jews is already running on thin ice because of his harshness with them in previous riots and previous results and his way of governing them. He's despised by them. He knows that another complaint, an official complaint by the Jews to Rome, could end up leading to a recall. And yes, by the way, that is a whole sacred practice that dates all the way back to Roman society. Recalling governors. For those who are wondering. Following what's happening today. And he has all this on his mind. And actually, he did end up getting recalled, by the way. A few years after this incident, the Jews complained, and Caesar recalled him. He removed him, he deposed him from his post in Judea. What should I do? What should I do to avoid a riot, to avoid a revolt? What can I do to appease the crowds? Should I just hand him over? I've already appeased the crowds. It's already one win. I've released to them Jesus Barabbas. They asked for him. What's the death of one man? A lousy, eccentric, lunatic teacher. That's no big deal. It would actually be like a second win. Now appeasing the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And then we'll have peace. No riots. And my position here of influence as the governor of Judea will be intact and will be secured. And so true to his form, as the shrewd and cunning and pragmatic career politician that he is, Pilate agrees. In verse 15, so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Releases a guilty murderer, and he condemns an innocent man because it was more convenient for him. Barabbas is gone. The crowds are cheering. And he has Jesus scourged, which was a common practice that the Romans used as an added measure of torture and to inflict pain on a criminal who was facing crucifixion and certain death. Then he handed him over to be crucified. You want to know what a Roman scourging looked like? Roman scourging had 3 levels of pain. What Jesus received was the highest level. In fact, it was so horrific that many people didn't survive the scourging and even make it to the cross. And that's why they added it in as a precursor of the cross, actually, to make sure to almost scourge someone to death so that they would only hang on the cross for a shorter period of time. They wouldn't have to wait for them. It was by design that way. It was so gruesome that convicted women were exempted from it. Nor were women allowed to witness anyone getting scourged. It was brutal. So what did they do to Jesus? Actually, the scourging was so brutal that the Emperor Domitian, who will become emperor a few decades later and lead almost an empire-wide persecution against the Christians, he was appalled by it. And he was a murderous tyrant who had the blood of thousands of Christians on his hands, and he couldn't even watch it. Just to give you an idea. That's what they're about to do to Jesus. And so they strip him naked to his inner garment, which would be like a loincloth. They tie his hands over his head to a post like this. 2 Roman soldiers on either side of him. Strong, powerful, trained killers. Each holding a long and powerful whip. And at the end of the whip, there were small leather cords connected to sharp pieces of bone and of lead and of metal and of glass. designed to lacerate, to rip open the flesh. And one by one, they start unleashing blow after blow after blow on the back, on the shoulders, on the legs, on the torso, on the face, wherever they could hit. And with each blow, the wounds and the lacerations get longer and deeper. And those bones and that metal at the end of those cords were designed to rip flesh, not just surface level skin. We're talking muscle tissue and down to the bone. One by one. Then he begins to cry out. Until his back and his body are so brutalized that it is nothing more than unrecognizable tissue and flesh and blood and bone. You want to know what he looked like? In Isaiah 53, that whole section that predicts the suffering of Jesus. This is what he says. Chapter 52, verse 14. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. Verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hid their faces. His body was so badly mutilated that he didn't even look human anymore. From the scourging and the beatings that are going to follow. Didn't even look human. He was so terrifying to look at, Isaiah says, that people had to hide their faces from him. They couldn't even look. Yet in all this, Jesus was not a victim. He gave himself over willingly. He knew it was the only way, and it was the plan of God to rescue and to save sinners. He did it willingly. Pilate asked the right question. He asked the right question. What shall I do with this king? The most important question. The question that all of us need to be asking ourselves. The question that maybe some here today or some watching online are asking themselves right now. What shall I do with this Jesus, this king? Now that I know the horrors that he suffered in my place, now that I know the horrific physical pain and abuse and mutilation that he suffered, and even worse, the spiritual agony he suffered on the cross when he received the full fury and the full weight of God's wrath on his shoulders for my sin in my place so that I can be forgiven and reconciled to God. What shall I do with this Jesus? And the answer is repent. Believe in this Jesus. Believe that he did that in your place so that you can have forgiveness and reconciliation to God, and then follow him as your Lord. Out of sheer gratitude and love because of what he was willing to do and to go through to rescue you. That's what you need to do. Pilate asked the right question, but he made the wrong choice. He made the wrong choice. He condemned Jesus to die, even though he knew he was innocent, because it was more convenient for him. It was the practical thing to do, the pragmatic thing to do. And it's the same for many of us today, many people today. They don't want Jesus because it's impractical. I don't want Jesus. I don't want to believe in Jesus, because if I have to believe in Jesus, that means I have to follow Jesus, and I don't want to do that. It's too much of an inconvenience. I love my lifestyle too much. I love my sin too much. I don't want to stop doing these things. I don't want to renounce being the Lord of my life. I have ambitions. I have dreams. I have goals. It's going to hinder my accomplishment and my career. I don't want Jesus. It's not practical. The crowds made the wrong choice too. They had a choice. They had a choice between Jesus Barabbas, a murderous, insurrectionist, freedom-fighting rebel, and a peaceful, gospel-preaching, miracle-working Galilean who came preaching peace and grace and forgiveness. And they didn't want that. Just like many of us today. We look back, probably even now, some of us in our minds like, wow, that was such an easy choice. What were they thinking? Why would they choose to release a clearly guilty man, a murderer, over innocent Jesus? What's wrong with these people? But the reality is, many of us today would make the exact same choice. It's the Western culture around us that pushes that, doesn't it, towards kind of hero worship. Look at the movies. Look at the video games. Look at the leaders, right? We revere those powerful, macho leaders who are willing to fight evil head on, who are willing to fight violence with violence and to crush the wicked, right? We would rather put our trust in them to protect us and to save us and to rescue us. Military leaders, powerful politicians, rather than choosing a seemingly weak and insufficient, suffering Savior who surrenders himself to mocking and to humiliation. Right? We'd rather trust a leader like that. He's a freedom fighter. We can trust him to protect us. He will serve us. He will save us. He's a patriot. He'll deliver us from suffering and death. And actually, that's another lesson that we can see from Jesus here. How he handles incredible, intense, the worst kind of suffering. The worst suffering anyone had ever endured when you consider the physical and the spiritual put together on that cross and the scourging leading up to it. And he did it humbly. He did it quietly. He did it in full submission and obedience and trust in God. And that example has served thousands of Christians throughout the centuries well and encouraged them in the midst of their immense trial and suffering and persecution. I was reading an example of one man who suffered an incredible ordeal in a torture chamber in South America. And he said, recounting it afterwards, that in that moment, all of his theology, all of his intricate, complex, lofty Christian doctrine was gone. He said the only thing he remembered in that moment was that Jesus too was on the wrong side of the whip. And he endured patiently, faithfully, trusting in God. And he said that's what got him through. What a tragic irony in the crowds and in Pilate's choice. The crowd chooses the one who takes the lives of others to achieve his own selfish gains and ends and interests, and would rather condemn the one who gives his life over freely for the interest of others. And Pilate, the same. It's more convenient for him to condemn an innocent man and to let a treacherous murderer go. So a convicted, guilty murderer is set free, and in his place, an innocent man is condemned to die. The false, right, the pseudo-son of the Father, Jesus of Barabbas, is exchanged for the true Son of the Father, Jesus of Nazareth. And it's a picture and a preview of what is about to happen on the cross when the innocent Son of God will finish what he came here to do. Jesus takes the place on the cross intended for Barabbas and is crucified with rebels. Just like he said in Mark 10:45, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. One in the place of many, an innocent in the place of the guilty. And nowhere is God's wonderful and abundant and infinite grace on fuller display than in the substitutionary atonement of the cross. Paul says it this way in Romans 5:8. God shows his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. The righteous for the unrighteous. Let's pray.